I didn't even think about it. That's all right. I won't redo it, but suffice it to say, if you need something, let me know and I'll get it to you. I didn't, man, I didn't think about it. All right, so here we go. Most of the chapters of Kings and Chronicles relate the events of course, the crown period of Israel and Judah. All right. First Kings continues this narrative where Second Samuel stops, and then of course Ezra continues the narrative where Second Chronicles stops. Now, like I said, I encourage you to go through that. Work your way through that. Don't let the end of Second Chronicles be the end of your study. Continue to go through that because there is more to hear. All right. All right. So there are some truths to be found, of course, that are common to both Kings and Chronicles. We're going to do 3 of these right now. Number 1, we're going to look at the 2 forms of government. We're going to look at the 2 forms of government. All right. 2 forms of government we had. What was originally God's intent for the nation of Israel was that never that it be a monarchy. Now, I understand that we look at God as king. All right. Now, that's not what I'm getting at here at all. But it was never intended to be a monarchy in the sense that it became a monarchy. It was supposed to be, and a lot of people, the idea of this, no matter who it belongs to, they despise it. But originally, it was supposed to be a theocracy. It was supposed to be a theocracy. They didn't need a king. They had a king. And God had given them the law. And that law was to govern every aspect of their lives. And he allowed them to do that. Remember, most of the Commonwealth period, he had given them the law, and they were essentially, I wouldn't say left to their own devices, but he allowed them to live their lives, always, however, looking at the law that had been handed down to them as the defining and the driving force behind everything they did. It affected every part of their life, not just what we would consider the religious aspect. Every part of their lives was a religious aspect. God told them how they were to deal with personal conflict. Right? He talked to them about health. He talked to them about agriculture. All of the things that they were engaged in, God gave them instruction in doing just that. The original purpose of Israel was to be a theocracy, not a monarchy. Not in the sense that it became the monarchy. All right. The king of Judah and Israel was Jehovah. All right. Oftentimes unrecognized. Right. It was they rebelled against him. They ignored him. But nevertheless, he was supposed to be the idea of the ever-abiding king. His plan is that he should not only be their God, the one that they would worship and they would recognize as the one who saved them from death and saved them from bondage in Egypt, but he was also their king. But what happened? It went from being a theocracy to a monarchy. And not just a monarchy, as we see as they devolve, they go from the highest point under David and Solomon, and they end up being this bedraggled, bereft, broke, put upon vassal state towards the end when they're carried away under Zedekiah. There are 2 forms of government in place here. We also have 2 thrones, don't we? We have the heavenly throne, and we have, of course, the earthly throne. And let's not. I don't want to short sell this idea. You know, in God's throne, does anybody sit on God's throne? God alone. No one sits on God's throne. He is the only one who sits on his throne. But how many times did the thrones of Judah and Israel change hands? And sometimes in the worst possible way, especially if you look at the northern kingdom. In the southern kingdom, it was established that David's line would sit on the throne. In the northern kingdom, there was no such promise given by God to the nation of the northern kingdom. So the throne was exchanged. It went across from person to person, and if this person had enough will and enough salt, then they could seize it. And that happened on more than one occasion, and we'll see several instances of that as we go through the study. But there were two thrones: throne of heaven, the throne of earth. Of course, the one that's the most important. Now, does it matter who sits on any throne? If something were established in Israel and somebody sat on the throne, would it make a bit of difference? Not one bit. Would not affect anything, because we know that one sits on the throne in heaven, and that's the one that matters. It's the only one that matters. All right. So we also have two kinds of prophets. All right. We have two kinds of prophets that we find, and we're going to see these as we go through our study. You have the true prophets, and we read their words because they're recorded for us, aren't they? The true prophets. What does it say? If a prophet utters something and it doesn't come to pass, he's a false prophet. If he speaks from God and he says what he says and it comes to pass, then we know that he is a true prophet. What he says is right. But if he says something that does not come to pass, we can rightfully assume that he is a false prophet and he is not sent from God. So we have the true prophets, and then of course we also have the false prophets.
They'll say today somebody's a prophet, he speaks with probably 95% accuracy. Makes him what? Not a true prophet.
Not a true prophet. Ezekiel chapter 13 and verse 16. Bear with me. Ezekiel chapter 13. Verse 16. Let's look at verse 15 first. Thus I will spend my wrath upon the wall and upon those who have smeared it with whitewash. And I will say to you, the wall is no more, nor those who smeared it. The prophets of Israel who prophesied concerning Jerusalem and saw visions of peace for her when there was no peace, declares the Lord God. There were going to be prophets who were going to tell the kings and tell them everything that a true prophet was telling them. They would come behind them and say, oh, no, that's not the case. That's not really it. We, O king, we see nothing but good things. We see nothing but peace and prosperity, and continue on the path that you're going. So essentially, these are the same people that we find today that will tell someone who is in sin that they're not really in sin. The Lord does not really look upon X, Y, Z, whatever sin that might be. He doesn't really consider that a sin. You just keep doing what you're doing, and you don't worry about that. These people just hate. And that's not the case, is it? It's not the case. Matter of fact, we tell people that they're in sin because we love them and we don't want them to die in their sins. We're not like Jonah, who sits up on a hill and waits for God to smite the unrighteous. That's not what we want.
They were told in the New Testament that on the outside, you're like a sepulcher. You're all
right,
pretty and white.
White things. Oh, yeah.
The inside is what counts.
That's right. It's like the plate. The inside is filthy, but the outside is clean. These were men who were yes men, essentially. And the king, as like almost any other king, what does a wicked ruler do? He surrounds himself with people that are telling him that what he's doing is not really wicked. That it was expected, that you have the right to do that, that you are that there's nothing wrong with what you're doing. And there were plenty of these people all throughout Israel and Judah who would tell the king what he wanted to hear, not what he needed to, but what he wanted to.
But remember King Darius and his satraps. Oh, King Darius lived forever.
Mm-hmm.
And we told you that, to have everybody worship you for
Yep.
a month. And said Daniel's worshiping his God. The satraps were just basically.
There, yes, ma'am. Yep.
A lot of preaching today seems to be this, what you're talking about.
Yes.
Everything is hunky-dory, everything's good.
Yes. Yeah, that's an unfortunate thing, and that's what we find a great deal of in the world today. We do not find a great deal of gospel, godly Bible preaching. You go into a lot of places now, and there's almost no real preaching going on at all. It's they're trying to think of the word, motivational speakers.
This is my nephew used to preach in California, and his elders called him in and said they were going in a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeremy said basically that they expected a weekly TED talk.
Okay. Yeah. How to make people feel good about being there. When you go and you hear almost no Bible, and I listen in on preaching from different places, and I'll take a little sheet of paper and I'll just mark down. Not that having a lot of Bible necessarily means that it is a good sermon or that it is a Bible sermon. They just use a lot of Bible in it. But I mark down how many times they use a verse or portion of scripture and they use it in context, discussing whatever it is that they're discussing. And it's very disturbing to see how many people, and then afterwards, how many people say that was just the most uplifting and enriching talk I've ever heard. I heard a friend of mine said one time, sermonettes make Christianettes. And I think that's accurate.
Exactly.
We've got to hear teaching. But here are these prophets. They're prophesying to the kings of both the northern and the southern kingdom. Sometimes they were heard and they were obeyed. Sometimes, most of the time, they were not. They were ignored. In many cases, they were persecuted. As we go through the account of Ahab and what he and his wife did to the prophets that were sent to them, it would get to the point where you'd say, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I can't do this anymore, Lord. And more than one prophet prayed to God, I can't do this. Nothing's happening. Either they're not listening, and God is saying to them, you just keep doing what I tell you to do.
That's
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yes. Now, tell you what, let's do. I'm going to stop right here for our first break, and I'm going to see if I can find some ibuprofen, some aspirin, some kind. Because my head is, I don't know what happened. My head is just pounding. All right. We'll go ahead and begin. I was asked when we went to our break, I was asked because we did not begin recording. Are we recording now? Okay. Since we were not recording from the very beginning, technical difficulties, no problems. But I was asked to repeat some of the things that I had written on the board.
And what's not technical?
I'm trying to be as nice.
Operator error.
Operator error. The mechanicals were working fine. Just our operator wasn't working fine. So I'm gonna repeat some of the things that I had written on the whiteboard behind me. If you've been here from the very beginning and you saw this, just bear with us. This is for everybody that may be watching this after the session is over, a little bit later on. So we talked about the 4 periods of Israel's history. All these start with a C. So number 1 is camp period. The camp period that started at the beginning when God called Abraham out of his father's house. And it started at the call of Abraham all the way up to Moses' bringing up the people to Canaan, where he turns the reins over to Joshua, and he dies before he is able to go into Canaan, of course. And the great thing about it is, guess what? He was able to enter into Canaan, wasn't he? Because who was on that mountaintop with Jesus? Moses and Elijah, right? God didn't allow him to physically go in there during that time, but he did go into Canaan. Of course, at that point, he was the highest man amongst the Israelites, and now he is under Jesus. But anyway, that's just a little side. This is about 660 years. The camp period was about 660 years, and it started at around 2100 BC. Some scholars say 1800 BC. Again, we're not going to get caught up in that, but all the way to 1440 BC. So 2100 BC to 1440 BC. And this period is given, of course, in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Number 2, the Commonwealth period. This starts from when Israel first enters into Canaan under Joshua, all the way up to the crowning of their first king, Saul. And this is about 360 years total. And of course, this history is given in Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And this is from around 1440 BC to 1040 BC. So we got the camp period, we got the Commonwealth period. The one, of course, that we are concerned with in our study is the crown period. And it starts, of course, with the beginning of the crowning of Saul as their first physical king, all the way up to the Babylonian captivity. So the crown period from Saul to Zedekiah is a period of about 460 years. And this history is, of course, given in the books that we're 6 books altogether, 4 of which that we're studying. That's 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. That's 1043 to about 586 BC. That's the crown period. That's the period that we're concentrating on ourselves. And then, of course, we have the captivity period. This includes the restoration and it's extended from the Babylonian captivity to the end of the Old Testament history, a period of about 160 years. And this is Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther will contain most of that. And it's about from around 586 BC to 420 BC. All right. Let's see. I want to make sure we get all of that, everything that I had written up there. This is another thing that we had written up on the board. This is there are some truths that we find that are common to both Kings and Chronicles. And number 1, of course, we have the 2 forms of government. And in both of those, in both Kings and Chronicles, we have 2 forms of government. That's the theocracy that the nation of Israel was intended for them. And then we have the monarchy that the nation demanded for itself when Samuel anointed Saul king. So 2 forms of government. We have the theocracy, which was the original intent, and then the monarchy. So you had a spiritual king, a heavenly king, and an earthly king. Number 2, we had the 2 thrones. Of course, we all know what this is. If we have a heavenly king, then we have a heavenly throne. And if we have an earthly king, we have an earthly throne. Those are the 2 thrones. In Isaiah 66 and verse 1, it says, "Thus saith the Lord, the heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool." Shows God's power and magnificence over all creation and all mankind. And then number 3, so we have two governments, we have the 2 thrones, and we have the 2 kinds of prophets. There were true prophets of God, men whom God had called to the office. He spoke to them, he told them where to go, he told them what to say and who to say it to. And many times he told them what the response was going to be. He said, "I'm going to send you here, and they're not going to hear you, but you're going to go." Those are the true prophets of God. And then, of course, if there are true prophets of God, there have to be false prophets of God. We find that in Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 13, I believe is what we went to, where it says that there are going to be those who will prophesy peace for Jerusalem when there is no peace. We talked about yes men, and the kings, especially wicked kings, surrounded themselves with yes men. Men who would tell them everything they wanted to hear, would tell them that what they were doing was not only acceptable, it was approved. And that was the case. Then you have the true prophets like Elijah and Elisha, who went and spoke to the wicked king and his wife in Israel, and what happened to them. Oftentimes their lives were at risk. Okay.
Hey, Chuck,
Yes, sir.
you had the 3 divisions of the crown period also on the board.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I was trying to. I said I know I've written one more thing up there, and I could not remember. I could not remember what it was. Yes, three distinct divisions of the crown period. Number one, you have the United Kingdom with the 3 kings: Saul, David, and Solomon. You have the United Kingdom there. Then you have the divided kingdom when Rehoboam and Jeroboam split the nation in two, with the 10 tribes going up, 10 tribes concentrated in the north, and then Judah and Benjamin in the south. And then you have the surviving kingdom after they came back from captivity, which is Judah. But remember this, they not only survived, they survived the split. They remained long after Israel was dispersed and blown into the wind. They remained after that, and then when the captives were let go by Cyrus the Great, that was predominantly Judah, and they came back and basically became a shadow of their former self. They never regained their glory. But yes, there were 3 distinct divisions of the crown period: United Kingdom, divided kingdom, and the surviving kingdom. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. Do you see anything? I'm trying to remember. Was there anything else that we had?
No, sir. That's all I had.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Very good. Very good.
Thank you, sir.
Not a problem. Okay. So a couple of things that we need to look at. As I said, there are some things that Kings and Chronicles have in common. And then there are some things, of course, that we have comparisons and contrasts. So here we look at some contrasts. The relationship of Chronicles to Kings, and I thought this was a very interesting statement. The relationship of Chronicles to Kings is similar to the relationship of the Gospel of John to the Synoptic Gospels. So you have John, which is a gospel, absolutely 100% a gospel of Jesus Christ. But then you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Why they call them the Synoptics? Because they compare so well. Many of the accounts are the same in all 3 of them, but John is something that's very different, written for a specific purpose, but it is a gospel of Jesus Christ. But the relationship to Chronicles, from Chronicles to Kings, is that kind of a relationship of John to the Synoptic. There are identical events that are recorded in both of them, but the later books, the Chronicles, do more in the way of interpretation and reflection. Okay, so Kings, the book of Kings, narrates the political and royal fortunes of the nation. But Chronicles looks at these in the light, and as it's phrased here, in the light of the sacred and ecclesiastical. What does this mean in the sense of how God views what's going on? Does he approve of it? Does he disapprove of it? Is it worthy of punishment? Is it something that he suffers for a period of time? Is it what is his mindset in regards to this? Kings is more of a here's an account. All right, much in the same way like Samuel. Here's what happened. Here's what happened. Here's what happened. Here's what happened. Chronicles talks about the idea of what does God do in regards to this blasphemy.
That's what I was thinking. Is Chronicles kind of like a diary, or is it just a chronicle, a record?
Well, I mean, you think about the word chronicle technically means a record, but if you look at, we've been looking at First Chronicles, and we see what God interjects himself into Chronicles a great deal. It talks about it in view of what these people did, but how that is viewed in light of God's judgment and God's viewpoint of it. Kings is more of the diary type of thing of this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. But again, the identical things are recorded in both. Say, for example, this person became king of Judah. That's mirrored in Kings and Chronicles. Kings, it's more of a, hey, this happened. Chronicles talks about the idea, and he did what was wicked, and he did what was wrong. He followed in the footsteps of his father, and that's kind of the relationship between the two. Kings talks about, this is what occurred.
I think one is for maybe applicable than the other one, like Chronicles.
I think they both have their purpose, and they both had to have their purpose, or they wouldn't have been written. As you, I would look at, and I'm not saying to do this. I'm saying if I were looking at more of what happened and when did it happen, Well, if I was going to do that, say amongst the Gospels, which one would be the best one to go to?
Let's just throw out John.
Who in your opinion, think about it, who did the best job, because that was the purpose behind that account, who did the best job of recording days and times and seasons and the people and all of what we would consider minutia, but it's important. It's incredibly important in certain areas. What's that?
Luke.
Absolutely. That's why Luke, I believe that's why God inspired Luke to write the book of Acts, because things are recorded. And not only are they recorded, but Luke throws in little details that we can look back even through the history books, and we could say this. He says this was the emperor, this was the governor, this was the whoever it might be, the person in charge of this area, and this is the area in which it occurred. And guess what? That one thing that we love about the Romans, is that, man, they were very good at taking notes. They were very good at keeping records.
See, I think that's besides Luke. That was one of the reasons Luke chose, because as a physician, he had an attention to detail.
Very much so. Needed to, right? Needed attention to detail. I like a doctor. I like a doctor that's you know, he's not coming in looking you over real quick. Okay, that's good. He wants to say, well, show me what's going on, and exactly right. Okay. So when I think of this, in my opinion, Kings is the one that I go to if I want to know what were the circumstances, what was going on, what were the details behind all of this, and then Chronicles would be a good idea. Would take us to how does God enter into all of this? What's God's viewpoint in regards to what's going on?
So when Chronicles means accounts of our days, explain that.
Well, the guy the fellow that penned that name or started using that word Chronicles, Jerome, he felt that it was a better fit for what was being documented than the Hebrew word, which means accounts of our days. It doesn't. Both of them are equally applicable. We could just go on with one over the other. But it's easier to say First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, than First and Second Kings, First and Second accounts of our days.
Yeah.
So the one word thing helps out a lot, but it doesn't mean anything other than that. That's he felt it was a better fit. I tend to agree.
Just to make sure I understand this, First Kings then is less documented than Chronicles is?
No, First Kings is more. It's more. It speaks more to the date, the minutia, the details. And Chronicles is more along the lines of the idea of the sacred and how does God view what's going on?
Okay.
Well, we'll see here in just a couple of minutes. There's some other things that might help us understand that a little bit better. All right.
This is Margaret. I've got a question. Could that be kind of Kings being a cause and Chronicles being the effect, in a way, cause and effect? Sort of.
You could probably make a point of that. Yeah. You can make a case for that. I don't know if again, I don't want to make it where I don't want it to seem like Kings is this particular thing and Chronicles is this particular thing. And because remember, the accounts are very much the same. Now, as I said, in a couple of seconds, we'll talk about where Kings talks more about one thing and Chronicles talks more about this other thing. But at the end of the day, they have events that are recorded in both. One of them talks about this is what's happening in the kingdom, and the other one talks about God's attitude and viewpoint towards it, how it is a rebuke or a rebellion against His word, or how it helped the nation grow closer to its word. Okay. Again, I don't want to draw this black and white dichotomy between the two at all. But there's a point. There's one is to do this and one is to do this, and they complement one another. But as we saw from the beginning, the First Kings and First Chronicles don't parallel one another, do they? First Chronicles starts all the way back at Adam, and it works all the way forward to David David passing at the end of First Chronicles. And First Kings starts, as we'll see here probably next week. I don't think we'll get to it tonight, but as we see, First Kings is going to pick up at a particular point where Solomon is about to begin his preparations for building the temple and all of the things that he begins to institute in that kingdom that really is the beginning of his downfall. And some of the things that he does directly affect the way the kingdom will split after he dies. Because if we look, when they say, well, I don't want to get into it because we're going to get into it a little bit later on. I'm going to repeat myself next week, and that doesn't make any sense. But this is the case. The Kings narrates the political and royal fortunes of the nation as a whole, and then the divided nation. And the Chronicles looks at these in the light of God's word, what it means to them. For example, Kings, and I'll give you a couple of examples here. Kings, number one, gives you a prophetic perspective, judgments. All right, that's in Kings. In Chronicles, it gives a priestly perspective. In other words, hopes. So for Kings, number one, prophetic perspective, judgments against the nation. Chronicles, we have the priestly perspective, the hopes of the nation. Number two, in Kings, we see the wars and the conflicts that go on in both between Israel and Judah and the nations outside. We see the wars are featured very prominently. In the book of Chronicles, we read that we see that the temple was very prominent in the writings of Chronicles. All right, number three. In Kings, we see the fortunes of the thrones, both thrones, Israel and Judah. And in Chronicles, which is going to predominantly favor Judah in what is accounted for. That's what we're talking about here. When it says it favors, it means that there's going to be Israel is very rarely, especially in the divided kingdom, is very rarely mentioned. It's the continuation of the Davidic line in Chronicles. So number three is the fortunes of both thrones in Kings, and in Chronicles, it's the continuity of the Davidic line. Number four, in Kings, we have a record of both Israel and Judah, as I said a moment ago. We have a record of both Israel and Judah. Because there's a great part of Kings that's devoted to Ahab and Jezebel. But in Chronicles, the record is primarily of the southern kingdom, Judah. And number five, in Kings, we see a great deal in regards to morality, both bad morals and good morals. Morality can take into consideration both of them. We see a great deal of immorality in the northern kingdom and in the southern kingdom, to be honest. There's only very rarely is there good things mentioned about either kingdom. So morality in Kings and in Chronicles talks about the idea of redemption. And part of that goes into God when he says he tells the prophets to warn the southern kingdom that he will allow them to be carried away in the same way as the northern kingdom. But he said this: what is he going to do with the southern kingdom that he doesn't do with the northern kingdom? Southern kingdom, he's going to bring them back. He's going to allow them to come home. Okay.
Southern kingdom. I thought we said earlier, southern kingdom meaning Judah was taken by Assyria. They never came back.
The northern kingdom was taken by Assyria.
The northern kingdom.
Yes.
Thank you.
Northern kingdom taken away by Assyria and never returned in the manner that the southern kingdom did. I imagine there were people who finally found their way back home, but it wasn't the release that the southern kingdom received, because they were not in God's favor. God allowed them to be carried away because their wickedness was a continual stench.
So Israel
never came back. The northern kingdom never came back. Israel came back in the sense that it was the southern portion of Judah.
And then you said Kings, both thrones, and then Chronicles, I missed that.
Let's see. We're talking about number 3 or number 4?
Number
Number 3, Kings, the fortunes of the thrones, both thrones, northern and southern. But in Chronicles, it talks about it's the continuity of the Davidic line, because remember, most of it's talking about Judah. Well, Judah is the Davidic line. Seed of David is going to sit on the throne of Judah. All right, what's the purpose behind the books? Well, I mean, for one thing, all profitable. That's a hit in my head. All scripture is what? Profitable. It's good for us. It's good for us to study. We can get something. I mean, you look at it, as we've gone through the book of First Chronicles, there were a lot of lessons we took away from it for even today. But at the end of the day, the main purpose of the books is, of course, to establish a record. That's absolutely the case. But it's not simply to record the facts of Hebrew history. What it does is it reveals the hand of God in the affairs of men.
A lot of people say, this isn't mentioned in the Bible, that isn't mentioned in the Bible, so we don't know if it's wrong.
Well, if it's not mentioned in the Bible, then that could probably be accurate. But if it is mentioned in the Bible, then there's something for us there. Even the most obscure passage and the most obscure verse, there's something there. Whether it was written directly to us or not, do we glean something from the book of Revelation? Absolutely.
Everything is there that needs to be there.
Yeah.
Everything is there that he wants us to know. That's why we have the acronym BIBLE, basic instructions for the year.
So there we go. All right. All right, so there's this, and I'm going to give you another. I'm going to give you another quote. I'm not going to write it down and require it from you. Just will give you this quote. Charles C. Cook wrote this. Says the books show how the rise and splendor and the decline and fall of the kingdom were the results, respectively, of the piety and faithfulness, or the sin and idolatry of the various kings and their subjects. For this reason, much that would be of merely secular interest is omitted or summarized, while incidents that deal particularly with the divine purpose and the moral and religious conditions of rulers and people are narrated at length. That's a long quote, and that's why I'm not requiring it of you, but I think that makes perfect sense. Think about this. Everything that we see that's written at length, any passage that deals specifically with the sin or the righteousness of any given king, it's as it's narrated at length, it almost invariably deals with the divine purpose of God.
Reminds me of the saying, it says, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolute.
Absolutely. That's I'm thinking, is that a Kissinger quote? Anyway, it's absolutely correct. But remember, at the end of the day, God warned the people through Samuel, those many years ago, that this was going to happen. And he made it clear to him. He says, it's not that they've rejected you, they have rejected me. Can you imagine being the God that brought them up out of Egypt? He took them in there, this small group of people. I believe at the beginning it was around 70 people that he took into Egypt. And then when he brought them up out of Egypt, they were almost innumerable. And he did all of this. He brought them through the lands. He took them to the nation. He conquered it for them, using them as his instruments. He conquered this nation, brought them into this nation, established them, blessed them, continually blessed them, and then to have them reject him in favor of a man. And that's exactly what they did. They rejected God. They wanted a man to sit on the throne. Why? Because that way they would be like the other nations. That's what they wanted. And he said, you're going to be a peculiar nation. You're going to be a coveted possession for me. You're going to be separate from everyone else. And they rejected him. And he said they rejected him. And we can't say that, well, he was mistaken. They didn't really. No, God said they have rejected me from being king over them. He said that. If he said that, that means it's accurate. That's exactly what they had done. And he warned them, this is what's going to happen. These kings that you want so badly, This is what they're going to do. They're going to take your best. They're going to take your brightest. They're going to take your sons and daughters. They're going to take your lands. They're going to take your money. They're going to take everything. And they're going to do it. And they're going to magnify themselves. And that's exactly what we find. David was far less inclined towards that than Solomon. Solomon established himself almost like one of the pagan rulers. Everything was done to his glory. And then the subsequent kings that went through, except for the ones that repented and came back, they were the same way. They took everything that they wanted. Look at Ahab. Look what did he want? He wanted that vineyard, and he wanted it no matter what it was going to cost, to the point where he allowed his wife to have a man killed so that he could possess something. How many vineyards did he have? How many vineyards did he need? But I want the vineyard of Naboth, the Jezreelite. Only that one will do, because I want it for a vegetable garden because it's close by my house. That's just wickedness. He said, why would I sell you my birthright? So his wife said, you don't worry about that. I'll take care of this. We'll read about that. That's an account. That's one of those. That's in much the same way. That's the idea of David taking Bathsheba away from Uriah. Here's the problem. Here's the situation. When David was truly confronted with his sin, what did he do? He repented. When Ahab was confronted with it, what did he do? Nothing. Nothing. It wasn't until afterwards that he was truly confronted in his sin. He repented, but only for a period of time, then went right back into sin. Okay. All right. So that's the purpose. It's to show God's hand in the affairs of his people. Not only his people, of course, the nations at large, but predominantly his people. How did he deal with them? How did he rebuke them? How did he punish them? How did he reward them? It wasn't all doom and gloom. He did continue to bless them in the ways that they needed it. So anyway, that's the purpose. Now, why is it important that we study it? Why is it important that we study the book of Kings and the books of Kings and Chronicles? Well, a couple of points. Number one, it's an early history of a very important nation. It does tell us about God's people. And it's a continuation of a history that's been recorded since pen was first put to whatever medium in studying of the account of the Garden of Eden all the way up to this point. So it gives us an early history of a very important nation. At this point, it is a nation. So it does tell us some things. God's chosen folks. The nation of Israel is in God's thought and purposes, and it's a key nation in the history of mankind. Now, there are a lot of people that are in the field of history that tend to dismiss Israel almost altogether. There are those who do not believe that Israel was ever a nation in the sense that we read in the scriptures. They think that its importance and its stature was overblown, mainly through the Bible, and we don't really need to take that much account of it, but the Bible tells us otherwise. All right, so what was it supposed to do? This nation was chosen by God to do a couple things. It was to be his representative people. Remember, he called them out, much in the same way that God calls us out of the world and makes us, and we become Christians. He calls us out of the world. We are then a peculiar nation. In the same way that Israel was to God before, we are a possession for him. All right. So it is to receive and to preserve and to pass on his communications to man. All right. Through this nation, we have a good portion of our Bible. Through this nation, especially through that southern kingdom, that Davidic line, we have our Lord and Savior. So it's an early history. It says if you don't want to understand the people, study their history. That's what a lot of people tend to fail. They fail.
Then there's those who forget history are condemned to repeat it.
Satiana said that those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. We all know, if we would pay very close attention to what happened to the kings and what happened to the nation of Israel, we would be very careful about how we do things, about substituting our knowledge for God's knowledge and our self-will for God's will for us. Absolutely. A lot of lessons to be learned there. Number two, we have a basic philosophy of history. In God's dealings with his nation, we have a picture of his dealings with all nations, with all individuals, as far as the general principles of God's activity are concerned. Now, before it was a very concentration, it was a microcosm, wasn't it? was God at work with the other nations of the world? Of course he was. God's always has hands in the affairs. We think about, well, but it was just Israel. But how did Babylon come to defeat Israel? God sent them to do that. He was an instrument of, they were an instrument of his destruction, his vengeance and his judgment upon Judah. Same thing with the Assyrians. They were an instrument. They were a vehicle of punishment. Even if you look through the Commonwealth period, the judges, I mean, what happened? They refused to obey. They went into idolatry, so God would send them an enemy. And then he would raise up a man from the people to rally the people and through God's power to drive the enemy back out. But he did that numerous times, numerous tribes. So, they've gone into idolatry again. They've gone into wickedness. I will raise up an enemy for them, and I will send that enemy to smite them. And then I will raise up a man from within them, and he will assume a mantle using my spirit, and he will drive them out. And then the cycle would repeat. They would remain faithful for a while, and then they would go back into sin. The cycle would begin again. So God has his hands in the affairs of men. We don't know what he was doing halfway across the globe when Israel was in existence. We don't know how he was doing that, but he's always been at work in the affairs of men. If they'll allow him to, if they'll submit to it, he certainly has.
John, what was number 1? I'm sorry.
Early history of an important nation. If you go to, and we're not going to read all of, well, I'll read it. Daniel chapter 4, verse 25, and then 34 through 35. It says this. That's Daniel chapter 4, 25, and then 34 through 35. It says, the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomever he will, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. So God's rule is set. It will never fade away. It is always going to be there. God will always sit on the throne in heaven, no matter who's sitting on the throne on earth. Kingdoms rise, kingdoms fall, empires rise, empires fall, men come up, great men of earth, and they die. But God remains forever. Daniel makes that very clear. The Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men and give it to whomsoever he will. And that would be a very bitter pill to swallow, being Daniel. When you think about that. I mean, he was in the land of his forefathers and then was carried away in captivity. And Nebuchadnezzar was no benevolent monarch. The Babylonians were a brutal people. And if you want to look at the Assyrians, look up the Assyrians and look up the Babylonians and look how they dealt with the people that they captured. It was a brutal exodus out of Judah. I read somewhere, I believe they said that every mile, or equivalent of a mile, every mile or every so often, they would simply crucify in a gruesome manner. They just put somebody on the side of the road at the very head. So all of the captives who walked by would see one of their number having been brutally executed for no reason. I mean, it just said, pick one out and string him up. And that way, everybody walking by, the things that they would do to them, they took the young men and they made them eunuchs so that they would serve in the houses of their captors. That's why, Jesus said there are those who are eunuchs from their mother's womb. There are men who are made eunuchs, and there are men who make themselves eunuchs. Right. So this is all, and we have a hard time understanding this is all according to God's plan. God knew that they were going to do this, but he allowed it to happen. Why? Because he had to make them understand where they had gone wrong. And to their credit, as we said earlier, when they came back from captivity, idolatry was never really a problem for the Jews after that. They realized where they had gone wrong. Now, they were involved in all kinds of other sin, but idolatry was never really a problem for them after that. They rejected idolatry. All right. Let's see. And number three, we have a great many spiritual lessons for Christian living, as we said earlier. As we went through First Chronicles, we saw case after case, lesson after lesson that we could certainly learn from even today. And we need to, as I said, Scripture tells us all Scripture is profitable. What's it profitable for? All kinds of things. reproof, correction, instruction, all for our benefit. Now we may look at a verse and say, I just don't know what that. Well, you know what? That may not be something for me to learn from. It may have been something that somebody 2,000 years had to learn from, but it was profitable. It's not always necessarily geared at us. As I said, Revelation, who was Revelation really written to? First century Christians. People who were getting ready to go through some of the things that they were going to go through. It was of certainly benefit to them. Is it a benefit to us? Of course it is. We still study it even today. There were things that were uttered there that have already come to pass, but there are things that are written there that are for our benefit. We know that there's going to be a resurrection. We know there's going to be a judgment, and we know what the end result is of that judgment. There are some who are going to suffer for an eternity. There are some who are going to go to be with God in paradise. So, okay. A couple other things. Number one, the composition of the books, how the books are composed. What are they comprised of? And first one, of course, in Kings, in these books, the author of the book, which is who? Jeremiah. He wants to give us a pretty comprehensive history of the leadership of all of the tribes during this era. Now, of course, in First Kings, in chapters 1 through 11, the narrative runs pretty smoothly because only one kingdom is involved, right? All of the tribes of the United Kingdom, they're all involved in this. Now, as we get a little bit further in, it kind of breaks up a little bit, but he still seeks to say, hey, this is happening up here. This is happening down here. This is what's going on. And you'll find in the book of Kings, the books of Kings, you'll find that he will talk about even tribes that are far removed in the farthest corner of the kingdom. He will talk about them. He will mention them and the things that are going on, even in the northern kingdom and in the southern kingdom. Now, from as I said, from 1 Kings 12 to 2 Kings 17, there are two kingdoms, right, existing side by side. You got Israel in the north and Judah in the south. So the account is a little bit more difficult to read, but still, it's obviously doable. It reads a little bit more difficult because he shifts the narrative from one kingdom to the next. He talks about, and this man became king in Israel, and he did evil, and it'll talk about some of the things he did and how he brought in apostasy or how he continued in evil and idolatry. So there's that. Then, of course, at 2 Kings chapter 18 to the very end, there's a return because at this point, there's only one kingdom left. Southern kingdom is all that's left. So it runs a little bit more smoothly at that point. I'm only talking about the southern kingdom. All right. Now, in Chronicles, a little bit more selective than Kings. The northern kingdom is hardly mentioned in the books of Chronicles. And the author is a prominence in the book is this continued lineage of David, all the way from the very beginning, from the time Saul is removed from David, all the way through to the very end. David's line rules in Judah. Why? Because God said that that's what would happen. He promised David that. And when God makes a promise, even when evil men sit on the throne, God's promise doesn't fail. And that's, you think, well, I wouldn't, in our minds, what do we say? Well, I wouldn't blame God if he broke that promise. I wouldn't blame God if he took that man off the throne and established another kingdom, right? But where's the problem with that? God made a promise. God's promise does not fail. He doesn't go back on it simply because things aren't going the way he wants them to go. Because at the end of the day, now remember he said he was going to take the nation or take the Israelites into Canaan, right? But when they're still heading that direction, what does God say about the people? He tells Moses something. It's very, very interesting. He essentially says this: let me just destroy these people, and I'll raise up another one. But the interesting thing is, Moses isn't going anywhere. He says, I'll raise up another one through you to take into Canaan. So his promise still hasn't failed. His promise still hasn't failed. I will still raise up a nation through you to take into Canaan. And Moses said, no. He's pleading with God on that. Yeah, I wonder if the people knew how many times Moses went to God and said, God, don't smite them. Don't destroy them. And he even appeals to God's nature. He said, what's going to happen when all these people, your enemies, find out that you brought these people out there and then kill them and let them be destroyed? So Moses actually goes as an appeal to God, much in the same way he's kind of like a Christ figure, isn't he? He was a go-between between the people and God. And how many times did he keep? What's that?
Mediator.
He was a mediator.
Yes.
I mean, and God's just, look, it's nothing for me to do this. If you think I can't destroy these people and raise up another one, that's not going to be a problem for me. And I'm about fed up. So with that knowledge, how many times can you think that Christ has gone on our behalf to God and said, wait, give them a chance, allow them a little bit more opportunity, allow them a little bit more time. Let me work a little bit harder through this. Yes, sir.
So for me, what's fascinating about all this is that this goes back to the very essence of the very being of God. Who
Yes.
He is.
Yes.
He is holy, means he's set apart,
Yes.
transcendent from all that is immoral and sinful,
Yes.
etc. And he's also loving. So he is both equally, not one more than the other. He is holy, he is love.
Yes.
And before sin came into the world, those two were in perfect harmony. But when sin came into the world, his holiness demanded justice.
Had to have it.
He had no option.
Had no
It's
option.
in-
Absolutely.
it's his very being. But
Right.
the tension exists because his love demands mercy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that tension continues to exist.
Yeah.
And that's brought out in what the things you're talking about.
Very much so. The idea, I think it's what's of course very well stated. The idea that God's ways are greater than our ways.
Yeah,
Well,
55:9.
We have again, we think in our very human standpoint was, I wouldn't blame God if he simply broke the promise and did something else. I wouldn't blame God at all. As a matter of fact, and we like to say this, and I've said this in the past, I'm much more hesitant about saying it. If I were God, I can't put myself in that position. I have no right to. And by doing so, I've negated what exactly the holiness of God. Because what I'm saying is that my human standpoint, my human viewpoint of this particular situation, I would allow my human standpoint, my human viewpoint to change. I would do something differently because of what I understand. And I have to stop and say, I got to quit thinking that way. God's purpose is always righteous. Everything that he did for the nation of Israel was righteousness incarnate. And I agree exactly that concept of it requires something. It requires something, doesn't it? And again, even our belief requires something. It's not enough simply to believe. There must be action taken. Has to be action.
Scripture also says that demons
But they won't do anything about it, will they?
Oh, they tremble.
They tremble. That's about it. Which, that would be the least of what I would be doing. So,
Well, you have John 12, the Pharisees who believe, but because of fear of
being put out. That's right. That's right. The action was arrested. They weren't up to the task.
So David, was the reason why God gave Judah more time than what he gave Israel?
Not necessarily because that he gave them more time, although it was. He said, in meantime, he said it was because of my servant David, and he brings that up continually. But at the end of the day, toward the end, remember, they made a great stab at bringing themselves back to restoring themselves up. But remember this, and again, this goes back to God's promise. God, for a number of years, said, if you will return, I will keep you where you are. If you'll return. And he kept warning them, return, repent, return, repent. And finally got to the point where he said, now judgment is going to happen, and there's nothing that you can do about it. It is going to occur. So God made the promise that he would restore them if they would be restored, but then he made them a promise that he was going to punish them, and there's really nothing they could do from that point on other than continue to pray, always continue to pray that they would be brought back. He would restore them to the kingdom. And he does so, but never to the extent that they were at before. Yes, sir.
So in a sense, I think it's somewhat accurate to say that it was because of David, but there's a bigger picture here. involved,
Exactly. Yes.
Which goes back to the Abrahamic covenant, goes back to the promise of a remnant
Yes.
to bring Christ through Judah.
That's the key.
That's the key.
That's the key.
So you had the
Yeah.
priestly and the king, and David was the king who had the heart. And so in a sense it's David, but it's associated with an omniscient God who knew David's heart and knew that through his lineage would come the antitype king,
Right.
Christ.
The whole point of them returning was not, and this is, and see, they had a profound misunderstanding about why they were bringing, but they continued to believe this for a number they continued on through the time of Jesus Christ. They believed that they were in the place that they were. Let me put it this way. They were in the place that they were. They were brought back because of the promise that was made, but they were brought back not as a kingdom anymore. They were brought back because God said that, again, Jesus was going to come through the lineage of David. And it was going to come out of where?
Through the tribe of Judah.
Exactly, the tribe of Judah, in that land, in the city of David. So what do they have? What has to happen? He has to bring them back so that this thing can occur. His prophecy is always going to happen. It always has, always will. So he says, there's going to be a child born. It's going to be born of a particular tribe. It's going to be born in a particular place. It's going to be born into this circumstances, all of these things. What must have happened in order for that to occur? People had to have been allowed to come back. And so he brought them back and he set them up. And in the very barest of bones being a kingdom, they had the image of self-rule, but they didn't have self-rule, did they? They no longer ruled themselves. They were a servant state of another kingdom somewhere else, another empire. They no longer occupied the position that they were before. It's like Hosea, right? You see, he went back and he got his wife time and time again, and it's the last time that he went and got her. He brought her back, but she was not a what to him anymore. She did not occupy that position of wife. She was like a servant in his home. It's the same thing with Judah. He brings her back, but she's not that. She doesn't occupy that position anymore. That's going to be taken away. It's going to be given to another.
Hey, Chuck.
So he brings, yes, sir.
You think about, you go back to Genesis 49 and the promise that, or the prophecy that Jacob made when he said that the scepter would never depart from Judah. This is all part
Correct.
of the big plan.
Yes.
Right.
God plays the long game, doesn't he?
Yes.
And see, we have a hard time. We have a hard time saying, we're all caught up in an election that's going to happen in November. God's saying that, I'm telling you right now, that won't mean a thing. In 200 years, it won't mean a thing. In 1,000 years, it won't. If God sees fit to allow this world or even this nation to be established, God is not as concerned with the rising and falling of countries or kingdoms or empires or anything like that. His plan abides, and it's going to abide. It's abide from the very beginning, and it will abide until the very end. And what we get all caught up in the here and now. And I understand. I'm not diminishing the concerns that we might have for this, that, and the other. But when we put our mind where God's is, we look at it and we say, you know what? It does none of this. At the end of the day, none of this really matters. The only thing that matters is the eternal commands of God. He absolutely does.
No matter how much we may dislike someone who's been elected.
Yeah.
He put that there for a reason.
Well, look at
It's
this.
only to teach us a lesson.
Think about Nebuchadnezzar. As Nebuchadnezzar is coming up, remember, his people considered him a god. Nebuchadnezzar was a god. His people considered him a god. All of his priests, all of the people that were surrounding him considered him a god. What was he at the end of the day? He was a man. He was a man. And who ultimately showed him that Jehovah was in control? Jehovah did. He brought him up and then he abased him. But at the end of the day, it was God that did all that. Now, Nebuchadnezzar's coming up thinking that he is some great thing. The gods themselves put me on this earth to do. No, Jehovah put you where you needed to be to accomplish his purpose. Again, I haven't quite gotten there yet, but I keep trying to push myself into that mindset that I have to have the mindset of God, not my mindset. You know,
Yes.
well, at the end of the day, what does Jesus said? He tells his apostles, you know, how to pray. He says, pray this way. Give us this day our daily bread. How many people still pray that? Not anybody. We know where our next meal is coming from. We don't have to worry about that. But what are we to pray? Lord, you're in control. You're responsible for everything. If I will simply let go and let you do what you do.
Well, God tells us, he says, your thoughts are not my thoughts.
No.
Nor are your ways. my
Your ways are not my ways. Now they should be, but they're not. Oftentimes we just let that fall. And we don't need to. We need to. Our ways need to be God's ways as much as it's humanly possible for us to let that happen. All right. So again, the author Ezra in Chronicles, the prominence is in this unbroken dynasty, Davidic dynasty that's going to culminate in the birth of Jesus Christ. It goes all the way through, and when they come back, guess what? It continues on. It continues on. All right. Let's see. So because of that emphasis on this Davidic line, I tell you what, that's a good place to stop. We'll pick that back up. We'll stop for another break, and then we'll come back at 8, and we'll continue on until 8:30. But 4 cups of this. We'll go ahead and get started back up again. Anyway, we were talking about the book of Chronicles, talking about that unbroken promise about the Davidic line all the way through. So because of that, you're going to see an inclusion of certain things in Chronicles that we don't find in the book of Kings. And I'm going to give these to you now. If you want to, I don't know how you're doing your notes, but the first one, this is be underneath the cap or the letter 2 Chronicles. This might be an A or a 1, however you want to do it. You'll look at the genealogies. These are important, right? That's First Chronicles 1 through 9. We've already talked about those, but it shows the Davidic line and the descendants of Levi. Why are the descendants of Levi important? They're going to be the what? They're going to be the priests, all those who work in the temple and those who go out or disperse throughout the tribes. And we also see the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin are pretty important interest. And you look at a lot of the tribes, and there wasn't as much mention made of those 10. But the 2, the Judah and Benjamin, were very important. Why? Well, what 2 tribes make up the nation of Judah? Judah and Benjamin.
Was Melchizedek of Levi?
Melchizedek?
Yeah.
No, he was a priest before there was a priestly line.
Before there was mention.
Yeah.
A priest forever after.
Mm-hmm. He was we're not given his father or his mother. He was just simply a priest of God he came out to greet, and that was the extent of it. But he knew the word of God, and God had certainly imbued him with authority. So much in the same way that
What's number 1?
The genealogies. And it talks about the Davidic line, which the descendants of Levi and the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin are primary importance. It discusses the other tribes, but Judah and Benjamin are more important because the nation of Judah, of course, is made up of Judah and Benjamin. Number 2, the high points of Judah's history up to the captivity. The high points of Judah's history up to the captivity. And also the prominent place given to the temple and the priesthood and the other worship items. And we find that in 2 Chronicles chapters 2 through 7. And we're going to go through those, but we're not going to get bogged down in details. It talks about all the preparations, all the things that Solomon, how the temple was built, its specifications, its measurements, and all these things, not of chief importance in our discussion, but we are going to talk about them. And the sheer magnitude of the temple. It was an absolutely incredible edifice. I've not yet seen. I've seen people who have done scale models of it before. I haven't seen anybody that's done has done it justice. It makes Herod's temple look like, a roadside truck stop. It was absolutely fantastic, gold plated. But by the time of Herod, of course, what's happened? All of the riches of Judah are gone. There's nothing left. So he did the best he possibly could. He rebuilt the temple. It was a place to go. and it had what was necessary, but all of the things that made Solomon's temple so magnificent had all been stripped away, and they were gone, and they weren't coming back. Any gold that Israel had went to where? Rome. They wanted it all, so that's where it went. All right. So that's our composition of the books. Now, tell you what, I'm trying to decide whether I want to go into this or not. Let's do this really quickly. The setting of Kings and Chronicles. The setting of Kings and Chronicles. You're going to notice key historical events of the period. Key historical events of this period, the crown period. In 1043 BC, we see the first king, Saul. In 931 BC, we see the division of the kingdom after Solomon's death. 931 BC is the division of the kingdom. And then in 722 BC, we see the fall of Samaria, fall of the northern kingdom. And then 586 BC, see the fall of Jerusalem and the southern kingdom. The utter destruction, the weeping and the wailing, begging for the mountains to fall on them. And we think about it and think, how bad could it have been? But when you're talking about a group of people who measured themselves according to God's love for them and God's care and protection for them, they were God's chosen. How could this possibly have happened? Hey, we could understand it happening to the northern kingdom. They were never any good anyway. But this is us, right? We're God's chosen. How in the world how could this possibly happen? God has abandoned us. He's and failing to remember all of the prophecies that had occurred up to this point. All those. But understand, people don't always think very clearly, do they? How many times does something bad happen to someone and that's what they want to do? They want to blame God. Never mind the poor choices that they made leading up to this. I'm dealing with someone who's dealing with a person who is very angry with God because of the situation that he finds himself in. And when the discussion is very frank and honest, we start asking questions, and they begin to come clean on all of the absolutely appalling choices that they made to get to the point they're at.
A lot of people something happens in their life.
Mm-hmm.
I heard an example in the sermon once that just really opened my eyes. This woman had lost her only son in Vietnam, and her preacher was trying to comfort her, and she lashed out and, "Where was your God when my only child was killed?" And he said quietly, the same place he was with his only.
That's right. That's right.
What was number 2?
Oh.
First king was Saul. That's number 1.
931 BC, the division of the kingdom.
And my second question is the fall of Samaria and the fall of Jerusalem. Was that the beginning of their captivity?
Yes, the fall of the northern kingdom in 722, the fall of Samaria, the northern kingdom, that was the carrying away of Israel, the northern kingdom. The 10 tribes, they were gone. They didn't come back.
That would have been like 130 years between Israel being taken off into captivity and Judah being taken.
Right. Yeah. So we think about 130 years, it's a long time, but in the span of Israel's existence, that's a short period of time. They didn't last for very much longer. And the only reason they continued on, God was still mad with them. He said it was going to happen, but he allowed it to hold off because of their repentance there towards the end. He pushed it off a little bit, but that judgment was always going to come to Judah. There was nothing that could be done about it. It was going to happen, but because of their repentance and their coming back, God pushed off that judgment that was coming their way.
And
so
70 years later, they didn't want to come back. Did they?
Well, it depends. I guess it would be on who we're talking about. There are going to be those who were taken away and they longed to come back. There are going to be those who remained behind because they just remained behind. There are those who were not allowed to come back because they were of incredible importance to the kingdom. It's said that Daniel never made it back to the promised land. He was too important. He had made himself So, you know, so
Indispensable.
indispensable, a good word. He was indispensable. So there were those who were sent back. Even Cyrus even made the edict that anybody who wanted to, anybody that was from there who wanted to go back there, they were to be released from any of his lands, no matter where in your kingdom they are. If the Hebrews want to go back home, you let them go, and they go back home. So you know, it wasn't that they were commanded to, but they were allowed to go back home. And Cyrus, again, a man called by God to do those things. You know, God came to Cyrus and said, "This is what you're going to do." See, Cyrus was a whole lot smarter than even the kings of Israel. When God came to him and said to do this, he did it. When he came to the very kings of the nation that he created, they wouldn't listen.
So Daniel
So-
continued to live in Babylon.
Yeah. Well, not Babylon, because at that time the Babylon had been supplanted. You know, so it was the area in which he was in, it's the same place, but there were different kings that had come in ahead of
So
that.
Babylon was no more.
Yeah, Babylon was no
God
more.
went.
Yeah.
Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, that the young men who ate the king's dinner and fatty meats and desserts and things, they were not healthy, but Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego were basically vegetarians who were healthy and strong and robust.
All because of what? They wouldn't defile themselves. Yeah, and they use those words.
Themselves as a king.
I want to defile there because there's no telling. I mean, they ate whatever they wanted to. They weren't kosher in the sense that Daniel and his friends were.
Right.
They certainly were.
They
They looked at some of that food and said, "No, we're not going to defile ourselves with that." So it tells us no matter where we are, we can still be obedient. Even it may cost us, but we can still be obedient no matter where we are. All right. So in the book of First Kings, which is the one we're going to get into next week, in the book of First Kings, three things that we find that are prominent in the book of First Kings. Number one, the ministry of Solomon the king. Hard to believe that he was a minister, but he was a minister. At first, he had great intentions. I do believe that. I do not believe that he was biding his time until he could do what he wanted to do. I believe that at the very beginning, he desired truly to be, and it possibly he wanted to surpass his own father, but it didn't happen because we see at the very beginning, I mean, really, I think in chapter 8 of First Kings, no, chapter 8 of Second Chronicles, he takes one of the daughters of the Egyptian king to be his wife. And I think that's the first account that we see where he starts heaping up for himself these wives of political marriages. But we do see the ministry of Solomon the king. He starts out strong with building the temple. He makes this great oration to the people. He offers up sacrifices to God. God shows that he accepts those sacrifices, and all is well and good. And then, of course, it falls apart towards the middle there. Number two, in First Kings, we see the split of the kingdom after his death. And number three, so the ministry of Solomon. Number two, the split of the kingdom. And number three, the ministry of Elijah the prophet. Have you ever wondered if that was true, that the Kings was all one thing? If you read First Kings 22 verses 37 through 53, and then you go to Second Kings 1 verses 1 through 4, and you see where that narrative of First Kings really kind of segues directly into Second Kings without any real significant break. It kind of tells us that our belief that the two books were once one is certainly the case.
You say split of the kingdom. Are you talking about the northern and southern?
Yes, that's when the northern and southern, they become the northern and southern king again. Now, did God have his hand in it? Yes, he did. And we'll see as we go through, we'll see that God did have his hand in it. He causes kingdoms to rise, and then he causes them to fall. All right, so in the very first chapters of First Kings that we'll get into next week, Israel is basically at about the height of her power and prosperity and influence. David was very successful through God's hand in waging war against the enemies of Israel and of God. So in doing so, he had really enlarged the kingdom. Some of that was still under enemy control over the period of Saul. Saul had allowed people to come back in and not driven them out again. And David basically took action. So he went up as far north as he could, and he pushed them out that direction. And of course, you have the river that gave that Jordan River that gave that nice border on the eastern side. But then in the south, he pushed them down far into Edom and Moab, and he had secured, I guess you'd call it control more than anything else. They were his vassal states rather than Israel being the vassal states of other. Vassal simply means they were servants. They were allowed a certain amount of self-rule, but at the end of the day, they all acknowledged David as ruler. And they would send tribute. That's how he got a lot of the stuff for the temple, right? He demanded tribute, and they brought tribute. And in doing so, he enlarged the borders of Israel. I think they had garrisons almost as far as Damascus anyway. So they were that bulwark of protection up there. And then as far down as Edom, trying to remember the name of the city. It's right there at Egypt, and I can't remember the name of it. I'll remember it for next week because we're going to talk about it. So he had these garrisons that were put into place, and it was subdued, right? It subdued the nations. So he had this control. Money was flowing in. The nation was very prosperous. The people were in obedience because they had David as an example. So David said, "We're not worshiping anybody besides God." He would drive if there was any problems with that, he dealt with it forcefully. So everything was good. So everything that David handed down, when he handed down the throne to Solomon, he gave him every advantage that he possibly could to maintain a kingdom that had been truly planted by God. Here it is. It's everything you need. You have plenty of soldiers if there's an uprising. If there's a war to be waged, you have plenty of soldiers. There's more than enough money if you need money. And you've got everything. I've got soldiers up north. I've got soldiers in the south. You're not at risk of being invaded. But all of this hinges on one particular thing, doesn't it? Every bit of this hinges on one particular thing, and that's their continued obedience. No matter what advantages Solomon had, if he refused to obey God, then none of that was going to do him any good. So it could have been all the best advantages, or absolutely zero advantage if he would refuse to be in obedience to God. So Solomon's reign was, of course, marked by an extended period of peace. Solomon conducted virtually no wars, but his reign was basically marked by internal development, right? Or number one, of course, what we read about is the temple. That great building project that David was forbidden to undertake, he handed that down to Solomon. So Solomon, one of the first things he did was begin work on the temple. You can imagine he was a young fellow, and this was a major project. I mean, and not just major as in the size of it, it's major as in the importance of it to the nation of Israel. This is going to be the focal point of the entire nation. Even to the point where during the divided kingdom, they set up altars in Dan and Bethel so that the people wouldn't come back down to Jerusalem to worship. They go down to Jerusalem, they won't come back. Maybe truth in that. So golden calves were set up in Dan and Bethel to keep the people from staying down in Jerusalem. So that temple in Jerusalem was a drawing point. It was a center. It was a focus of worship. Sacrifice to God. It was the place where everything was going to be contained. The tabernacle had not been set up in Jerusalem. So when the temple was established, there was no more need for the tabernacle, right? Yes, sir.
You may not know the answer to this question, but I understand the temple during Jerusalem time set up in Dan and Bethel for the purpose of
Right.
Keeping people from returning. Okay, I got that. But later on, Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman about the temple that's in Garrison.
Yes.
Right.
I don't know the history, and I haven't really studied the Samaritan temples or the 10 tribe temple
Mhm.
per se? Were
Yeah.
there 3 different locations? or-
Because this was her question. She says, where do we worship on?
Mount Gerizim.
This, and she said,
Yes,
your people say on this mountain, and my people say Mount Gerizim.
right.
Yeah, that's not my question. My question is Dan versus Bethel versus Gerizim.
Uh-huh.
How did Gerizim come about?
Gerizim, this is what I understand. The altars, the golden calves at Dan and Bethel were merely it was convenience. It was merely a matter of convenience. The mount where they worshiped was to them, and that was only for the Samaritans. That's where the Samaritans believed that they should be worshiping. And that all came about, of course, after the return of the people from trying to remember where they were. Under Cyrus. When they came back, the Samaritans, remember, the Samaritans rejected everything outside of the first 5 books. So what did they do? They found the only holy place that they could find in the first 5 books. So where did they go? They went to that temple to build or they went to that mountain to build their
It's
temple.
almost like Gerizim is a Samaritan built temple versus the 10 tribes of Dan.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. That was a Samaritan thing, and the golden calves at Dan and Bethel were for the Jews that lived in that northern kingdom. So they were there. The 2 Dan and Bethel were there long before the Samaritans established the temple on the mount.
Hey, Chuck,
No, that's fine. Yes, sir.
the Samaritans were not allowed in the temple, correct? Because they were half Jew, half Gentile. Because of the fact that they were a mixed breed race of people, they were not allowed in the temple, correct? Or am I wrong?
Yes, and and another thing, the Samaritans rejected the Jewish temple anyway.
Correct. Yeah.
They rejected it, so it was more of a thing. It's kind of like that old saying, I wouldn't want to be a part of any club that would have me as a member. And that's the same thing. It's like, well, we wouldn't go in there anyway. You can keep us out all you want, but we're not going to go in there anyway. So yeah, there was that animosity. To the Jews, honestly, the Samaritans were more unclean than the Gentiles.
Yes.
And you know how the Jews felt about the Gentiles coming into the temple past that court of the Gentiles that they could come into. They could go no further. Remember what happened when they thought, they thought that Peter or Paul had brought in a Gentile. Paul had brought a Gentile into the temple. They were ready to kill him. I mean, this was not going to fly. So yeah, the Gentiles were actually more accepted than even the Samaritans were. But the Samaritans didn't believe in that temple anyway.
Well, that's why Paul had to. That's why Paul had to have Timothy, or Timothy had to be circumcised.
That's right.
Thank you.
They could easily claim that he was a Gentile and had no business being in the temple. So it was. But again, this goes to show the problem with a physical temple versus a spiritual temple. This is why the spiritual is so much greater, and why God, in his enormous wisdom, saw fit to have the temple destroyed in 70s. So guess what? There's no more question about it. But then again, you've got people that still believe that if they had even a slightest chance, they would rebuild that temple. Absolutely would.
Ascension. Let's build 3 temples.
It was incredibly important to them. It was incredibly important to them.
Dome of the Rock is on the Temple Mount right now. It'll never go.
It's never. And can you imagine? Can you imagine if some person fooling it? Well, from what? Here's the thing. Here's the thing about it. God said he was going to destroy it. And if God says that he's going to destroy it, it's going to stay destroyed.
Yes.
No matter what some crazy Zionist might think. That temple was destroyed by God. The Romans did it for him, but God destroyed that temple not to be built again. Okay. We need to make sure that we understand that and that people understand that. God, no matter what some people might think, Jesus is not coming back to rebuild the temple and to reestablish the throne. He's not going to do it. Why? Because God destroyed it forevermore. Okay. All right. So Solomon's reign is lots of big building schemes. And I've not gone into too much of this. I've done a little bit of study on Solomon's internal improvements to the kingdom, bringing water in, establishing gardens, doing all manner of things. But a lot of this, remember, a lot of his buildings were built to his own glory.
Yes.
He built countless palaces for himself. He owned lots of land because he was the king. If he wanted something, he took it for himself. Multiplied wives to himself, multiplied in express disobedience, multiplied chariots to himself, and they were commanded not to do. So it was for all of the great things that he did for the splendor of Israel, much of it was in opposition to God's word. Okay. But not only was Israel captivated by what Solomon was doing, but the other nations, and they would send people to come and talk to him because of his wisdom. We read where dignitaries would come and sit and listen to Solomon and propose questions or pose issues, or yeah, she came and visited. It's interesting, we don't really know who the Queen of Sheba is or where she came from, but it was enough that God saw fit to document it. So apparently it was fairly important. And not only came, but brought him gifts. I mean, this, they said that, and I'm trying to remember, I'll find the verse because it will be something we'll talk about. It says under Solomon's reign, gold was as plentiful in Israel as the stone or something. I'll have to look. But it's essentially under Solomon, the nation just was thriving. Now, one of the problems was not all of this money was coming from outside as tribute. Not all of it was coming as gifts. Solomon taxed the people almost to death. He levied heavy taxes against his own people, all to magnify himself and Israel by all of these buildings. That stuff's not free. In fact, he takes at the very beginning, he takes the sojourners, the resident aliens in Israel, and immediately puts them to hard labor to start building all of this stuff, starting with the temple. So the temple was built by slave labor. Now compare that and contrast that with the tabernacle. Tabernacle was built willingly, lovingly by the people of God. But here you've got slave labor building this earthly temple that God's going to dwell in. Really quickly, Solomon, extremely wise in regards to most things, was very unwise in his disobedience to God's laws, his toleration of idolatry. And that's really what it comes down to. First, we tolerate it, then we embrace it, and then we force it. And that's exactly what happened. He tolerated the idolatry of his pagan wives, and then began to embrace it, and then began to enforce it as worship. I talked about his taxation. As a matter of fact, that's one of the problems that arose at the end of his life. It was the taxation of and his forced labor of the people that caused the kingdom to split. I think I read, and I want to make sure, and I'll find this out and let you know. I believe that out of every 3 years, any Israelite devoted a year of his life to working on Solomon's projects. Out of every 3 years, 1 year was devoted to the projects of the king. And as Samuel said, he's going to take your best men. He's going to make your men work for him. He's going to take your daughters to be his bakers and his seamstresses, and he's going to take your young men to run before him, run before his chariot. He's going to do all of these things, and that's exactly what happened. Solomon proceeded to really go off the rails fairly quickly.
They were all forced laborers. Every 3 years, 1 year were these forced laborers?
No. The forced laborers were for the children of Israel. They were for Israelites. They worked. Then the resident aliens, the sojourners, the people who were from the nations that lived within the borders, they were forced labor. And then the Israelites, I believe it was out of every 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years. 1 year was they had to give up 1 year for Solomon's project. So he forced his own people to work on his projects, but he forced slave labor on the sojourners, the people who were not Israelites that lived in the borders. All right. So we see that because of these actions after his death, We have his son that stayed in, that's Rehoboam, stayed in the south. And then 10 of the tribes revolted against his authority and formed the northern kingdom. And that was the beginning of that divided kingdom. Now, the 10-tribe kingdom of Israel was founded on idolatry, and things pretty quickly went south from there. It's not bad enough that you're in idolatry, but it went south from there. And before the book of First Kings closes, Jezebel has made Baal worship the accepted religion of Israel, the northern kingdom. And her daughter, Athaliah, is queen on the throne of Judah. And Baal worship is beginning to sap the religious life of Judah as well. So it just goes to show, be careful who your companions are. And that's it, folks. That'll close us out for tonight. Very much so.
Jezebel was part of the northern kingdom.
Jezebel was queen of Ahab in the northern kingdom, and her daughter was on the throne in the southern kingdom. And both of them had brought that Baal worship to bear on the both kingdoms.
So how long would you say it was? I know you said this earlier. Ministry of Solomon, and then the split of the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
So how many years was he pure and upright before there was a split of the kingdom?
Ooh,
You don't have to answer.
I don't have that answer. I'd have to look and see.
Oh, that's fine.
There's some debate as to whether he actually ever really returned in the first place. So I'd have to look and see.
Okay, no problem.
All right.
It is that time.